Listen, for the last couple of months, we've been studying the journey of the Israelites as Joshua leads them to inhabit what the Bible calls is the promised land. I want to read today from Joshua chapter 24. This is going to be our last week in Joshua, actually. And so we kind of hit chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7. And we didn't even really get into 8. 8's a really good chapter. 9's pretty good too. 10, there's this whole thing that happens with the weather. It's wild. You would love it. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, and 22, and 23 are all great chapters. You should go read them on your own. We're going to go to Joshua chapter 24 and verse 15. This is Joshua speaking. He says, "Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness." Not a little bit of faithfulness. You can't be faithful in just a little thing. It's all faithfulness. You're either faithful or you're unfaithful. He says, serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshiped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Come on, you know that. You've heard that before. But as for me and my house, let's say it together. As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. It is one of those iconic lines. It's like there are certain lines in history that just stand out, and you sort of know who said them and know where they came from. When you hear, as for me and my house will serve the Lord, that is a Joshua line. And this is like the equivalent of Joshua's, Dr. Martin Luther King, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. It's kind of the equivalent statement. It's Roosevelt saying, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. It's Forrest Gump saying, life is like a box of chocolates. You never know. It's Darth Vader saying, I am your father. It's just these iconic lines. You hear them, you can almost picture the person who says them. It's sort of like, oh, I remember when I heard that. This is Joshua's iconic line. As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. As we've studied his story, there has been a tension, a paradox that exists in the text, that God promised a land to Joshua, but there was an expectation on Joshua and the Israelites to possess what God had promised. God led them and said, I'm going to give you victory, but then there were wars to fight and battles to fight, and God gave them the promised land, but there was still something in Joshua and the Israelites that had to lay hold of it and take it for themselves. There is a tension when you're following God and believing God for great things. Legacy Sunday, which comes around once a year, is a Sunday when we fully embrace and jump into the deep end of that tension, because we know and believe that God has a plan. God has promises over our families. God has promises over our church, our city, and beyond. God has things he wants to do in your life, in your kids, in your future that you can't even wrap your head around. You cannot comprehend. Some of you are here in the room today, and if you had told you 5 years ago that you'd be here, you never would have believed it. It would not have made sense, but that's what God does. The challenge and the tension is that while God has these great promises and plans for us, there's this responsibility on our end to reach out and do something to embrace them. God wants to do things in your life that are like only God type miracles. He wants you to have such big faith, but there's this participation that's required where the tension is that, God, do you do the work of the miracle, or do I have to do some work to get the miracle? And it's both, actually. There are things that only God can do, and there are things that only you can do. There's a certain output that's required of us as we live a life of faith, but then there's an outcome that fully depends on God, and we work in partnership. It is a tension. Living a legacy life, a life that outlives you, that's a paradox. How can my life keep going after I'm gone? But that's what it is when you trust your life to the Lord's hands. It's living with conviction that what I do now and how I give now and the decisions I make now all have eternal significance. And so This is something we do every fall. In fact, if you showed up at church today and it's not your first time, then you are not surprised that it's Legacy Sunday. You knew it was coming, and God got you up out of bed, excited to be in church. Because we've been planning Legacy, and this vision season always has two strong arms for us. On one hand, we are believing for personal miracles. And on one hand, this is a time every year when we remind one another that God still does miracles and he still comes through and he still moves supernaturally and he still wants to move in your life. And you have hung prayer cards on the displays in both of our lobbies as a step of faith saying, God, I don't know how, but I trust you. Personal miracles. And then it all sort of culminates on Legacy Sunday when we all bring a personal sacrifice. We bring an offering that goes above and beyond the obedience of our tithe. It's something that we're getting seed in the ground. Households pray and we plan and we get seed in the ground and say, God, I don't know what this is going to do, but I know it's going to do more in your hands than it will in my hands. And so I trust you. And so today is that day we bring our sacrificial year-end offering to the Lord. If you happen to be brand new today, this is a great Sunday to be in the room. I'm not going to pressure you to give. We don't do high pressure offerings. That's not how things work at Experience Church. We do open opportunity offerings though, equal opportunity. You can participate if you want to. If somebody's charging you a ticket at the door, that's not Legacy. That's not us. That's not the way this works. But you do get, if you're here for the first time, a unique window into the heart and DNA of this church, that we exist for people outside the walls of this building. We're not here for us. We're here for people we haven't met. We're here for generations that haven't been born. We believe that we're building and investing and sowing and sacrificing now to build the kingdom of God in our time, in our city, in our nation. I'm here for my kids and my kids' kids. I'm here for your kids, for your kids' kids. We're here for the people outside the walls of EC that don't know Jesus but are desperate to find hope. That's why we're here. And so you get to watch people do something that is so counterintuitive. Who gives in a radically generous way around the holidays like this when most of the focus and attention is on what can I get and what can I get? And I've got all these bills and no. You're going to watch people step outside of their comfort zone and invest in others. On a practical level, more than 90% of the people who give tithes and offering here at Experience Church do so online. So I realize that most of the Legacy sacrificial gifts that are going to come today are not going to come in the moment. Many of you will go tap at the giving displays in the lobbies, or you'll pull out your phone at some point today or get out a laptop and you'll make that sacrificial investment. And some of you might have cash or checks or whatever. That's fine. We're here for that. I mean, we'll take it. You know what I mean? What I'm saying is, regardless of when you give or what you give, today is a day of shared sacrifice. And we're in it together. You might be prepared to give today. You might be planning to give over the next couple of weeks or before the end of the year in our Legacy offering. But today is the day that we set aside to be like, man, that's the day that I engaged my faith. I believed together with my church family for something personal, and I joined together with my church family to do something sacrificial. So I'm inviting you into a holy moment. I'm going to invite you to be part of something that's greater than any one person. And at the end of the service, we're going to take a moment and we're going to pray together for those individual miracles, believing for God to intervene and open heaven and cover every area of our lives. And then we will go and we'll give. It's all part of Legacy. Before we do that, I want to pick up the account of Joshua. I read from chapter 24. At this point, Joshua is 110 years old. He's been leading the nation of Israel for 30 years. They have conquered, but it's come at a cost. It's been battles, it's been blessings. And now near the end of his life, he comes out of his tent. He's this grizzled war veteran, a faithful man of God. People have settled in the promised land. He gathers them together, all the tribes, one last time, and he addresses the nation. I'm not going to read all of his address, but I want to just pick out a couple highlights. Joshua chapter 24, verse 1 says, Then Joshua assembled all the tribes of Israel at Shechem. It's the place they gathered. He summoned the elders, leaders, judges, and officials of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. Joshua said to all the people, This is what the Lord, the God of Israel says. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshiped other gods. But I took your father Abraham from the land. In verse 5, Joshua jumps, and this is the Lord speaking through Joshua. It jumps from the story of Abraham to the story of Moses. And God says, then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I afflicted the Egyptians by what I did. And I brought you out. I brought your people out of Egypt. It goes on, verse 11, the Lord's still speaking. Then you cross the Jordan. So it goes from Abraham's historical arc, and then there's the Moses arc, and then it jumps all the way to Joshua. Then you crossed the Jordan, Josh, and you came to Jericho, and the citizens fought against you, as did also the Amorites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hittites, Girgashites, Hivites, Jebusites. What Joshua is doing here is he takes time in what are some of his final words to the people, and he unpacks this summary of don't forget all of the things that God did to get you here. If I could summarize the talk, it's Joshua. He's having a very dad-like conversation with the Israelites, which essentially goes, you did not get here by yourself. You didn't get where you are today by yourself. I don't know if anybody can relate, but there are moments in our home when my kids think they own things. And generally they don't. They'll use words out of place like my bed, my room. I was watching my show, and I got to jump in and correct them and say, actually, that's my frilly bed. That's my pink room. That's my TV. I'm happy to let you sleep there for a while till we kick you out. I'm happy to let you occupy that room. I'm happy to let you rent my TV until there's a sporting event on that I want to watch. But if you really want it to be yours, it's going to cost you. And sometimes we just have to remind them, hey, whoa, sure, your room. That's what Joshua is doing with the Israelites. He said, guys, listen. And Josh has the authority to do this. It's been 110 years of faithful, obedient, and courageous, consistent living. When he talks, the people listen. When he opens his mouth, he speaks not just to the people in front of him, but to generations beyond him. And he says, listen, you've seen the progress. You're here. You're living in the land that God promised you. You've settled, but please don't forget that you did not get here on your own. Just because you've settled, don't settle. And that's why through the whole narrative, as Joshua is repeating the words of the Lord over and over again, God's reminding them who the hero is in the story. He said, hey, I brought Abraham out. I sent Moses. I brought you out of Egypt. I gave enemies into your hands. I gave you land. It all comes from the Lord. I think we have to remember today that it all comes from the Lord. The challenge to us today, if we're leaning in as if Joshua is addressing the crowd at Experience Church, is just because things have settled in your life doesn't mean you should settle in your life. What am I saying? I'm saying just because you don't have the chaos that you had when you were like 22 and you're wondering who you're gonna marry. Man, I'm so thankful that whole like who am I gonna marry debate has been settled for me. Just because that's settled doesn't mean I can settle. God wants to do more. Now, not in the area of marriage. We're good. He's still got more he wants to do in my life. Just because you got the job and you felt unsettled in one season of your life and now God is taking care of you and you got enough to pay the bills, don't settle there. Just because you're not living in that rented room anymore and you've maybe got a house and you feel like, oh, okay, I'm kind of settled now. No. Do not settle because you've settled. God is still working. God is still moving. God still has something he wants to do. The kingdom of heaven, the Bible tells us, is advancing constantly. The worst thing we can do is start to settle and think, well, now God got me here. I'm just going to sit back and enjoy and watch what happens. No. God wants us to stay engaged and to keep moving. And so Joshua says, listen, everything you have came from the Lord. Just because life feels a little bit settled for you doesn't mean you should settle and stop. And make sure you fear the Lord. Fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Don't forget to fear the Lord. In his language, he says, if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, he says that in verse 15, then choose for yourselves this day whom you'll serve. I love it. It's like, God did all this. And if that's not enough for you, I can't help you. Serve whoever you want to serve then. But as for me and my house, this is what I know. We will serve the Lord. Legacy is this consistent annual reminder that we have built into the calendar and the seasonal schedule and flow of our church to remind ourselves that while we might feel settled in certain areas, there ought to be a divine restlessness in your spirit, because God is always calling us to move out. God is always calling us into more faith. God is always calling us to grow and reach and have more impact. God didn't save you to settle down. He saved you for a glorious purpose. And there are still people in your sphere of influence that need to know the life-saving, life-changing, transformational power that comes from a relationship with Jesus. Do not take your seat and settle. Take your seat on a Sunday and get charged up to go live with purpose and intention and make a difference. Don't settle just because you've settled. And so what can we learn about a legacy life from Joshua's final words? I have three thoughts as he lays out for the Israelites the story arc of Abraham and Moses and what he's led through personally. I believe we look back to those stories and we're encouraged with these three thoughts. Firstly, legacy life requires steps. A legacy life requires steps. Faith requires forward motion. The Bible says that we walk by faith. Faith is not an observational practice. Faith is not a sit back and do nothing practice. Faith is not a stand still. Faith is a walk. It moves. It's forward. It is, as we've been describing it, obedience in the direction of God's promise, motivated by a confidence in his character. I'm going to have faith because even though it doesn't make sense, I'm going to trust that God comes through because I know that God is good. And as Joshua recounts the history of the promise, one of the things that knits the story together is that every central figure led with steps of faith. Abraham and his wife Sarah, they had to step into the unknown. The step of faith, the walk of faith, is to step confidently into the unknown. They had a good life. They had a comfortable life. By all intents and purposes, they had settled. They were fine where they were. But God came and unsettled them. He disrupted them. And he said, Abram, I'm going to call you. Abraham, I'm calling you out of that settled life into a faith-filled, stepping forward, moving life. And the call was confusing for Abraham because God said, hey, I'm calling you out. And Abraham said, okay, where? And God said, well, I'm not going to tell you. It's somewhere you've never been. God, is this a joke? But like, when are you going to let me know? He's like, I'll let you know eventually. He said, I just need to see that you're obedient and you're willing to take a step of faith into the unknown. All right, now, Abraham, I just need you to walk. I just need you to step. And it was more than just a place. It's not only is there a place, there's a people. What do you mean there's a people? Oh, Abe, you're going to have babies. Lots of them. Lots of little grandbabies running around. God, like, understand the story of Abraham. When Abraham and Sarah get called, Abraham is 75 years old. Sarah is 65 years old. They, like, nothing against the miracle working power of God, but her eggs are past their expiration date. And Abraham's not exactly a spring chicken. So there would have been disbelief. God, what are you talking about? We don't have any kids right now. This makes no sense. God said, I don't need it to make sense. I need you to step into the unknown. God, how are you going to do it? Just step. Faith is stepping into the unknown. And for 25 years, Abraham and Sarah stepped. And they stepped and they didn't know and they relied on the Lord and they kept walking until God said, that's the place. And they kept believing and they kept walking, and it was one step after another step, faithful obedience in the direction of God's promise, year after year. It was month after month. It was negative pregnancy test after negative pregnancy test after negative pregnancy test, but they kept moving. Because listen, faith isn't something that happens in a moment. You can't say, well, today I have faith. Well, if you really have it, you'll have it tomorrow too. That's how it works. You don't just have faith that one time you pray the prayer. You have faith the second time you pray it, and then you have faith the third time you pray it, and then you have faith when you've been praying it for 10 years and you pray it again and it still hasn't happened. It's faith is proven and tested over the long term. It's refined, not by what I feel in an emotional moment, but by my deep conviction to trust the Lord and keep moving in his direction. Faith is a long play of stepping into the unknown. It didn't look like what Abraham thought. It would look like, I'm sure that at 75, God's like, yo, hey man, you're gonna have a baby. I bet he thought he was gonna be a dad by 76. But it didn't happen. It almost never happens the way we think it should happen. That's not how God works. He just asks for us to step in obedience towards the unknown. That's legacy faith. So there's legacy faith is a step into the unknown. Legacy faith is also a step into the impossible. It's a step towards the impossible. That's exactly what Moses did. Moses leads 1 million plus people out of slavery in Egypt. He's following the Lord. He's doing his best to be obedient. He gets them out. They exit the land and they're moving through on their escape route, and God leads them right up to the edge of the Red Sea. While they arrive at the Red Sea, Moses turns around and can see that the armies of Egypt are coming behind him. So they've got a sea in front of them. They've got an army behind them. It is absolutely impossible. And Moses is standing there facing an impossible situation. And listen, there's no good way to get 1 million plus people across the sea. There had to be some disbelief. There had to be some, God, what is happening here? God, how did you lead me here? God, why is the thing in front of me so beyond my scope and comprehension? This is impossible. And God says, hey, I just need you to raise your staff, and then you're going to walk across on the other side. God, that makes no sense. That's okay, Moses. Just raise it up and take the step. But God, I don't understand. What good is my staff gonna do in this particular situation? It looks impossible. Can I encourage you? Faith is a step into the unknown. Faith is a step into the impossible. It's praying and believing impossible prayers. Can I encourage you today? We've got to pray prayers that we can't answer. Some of us are praying safe prayers. So we're praying safe prayers about a job that if we just put out some resumes, we'd get it. We're praying safe prayers about situations that if you just changed a couple things, it would fall into place. I'm telling you, the real time to pray a prayer of faith is not when you know how it could all work out, but when you're facing something impossible. Faith kicks in when the doctor says, chemo's not working, we've got no choice. Faith kicks in when the clinic says, I'm sorry, you're never having a baby. Faith kicks in when you don't see a way to end the conflict in your marriage, but you start praying, God, I do not see a way out of this. I need a miracle. It seems impossible. Faith starts when your possibilities run out. That's what it is to step towards the impossible. If your prayers can be answered by you, then you're not actually praying to the Lord. Step into the unknown. Step in to the impossible. And then as the Lord describes what happened with Joshua and the Israelites, it's an encouragement to step into the absurd. I'm not going to recount the whole story. We've been there for 2 months. But Josh, I want you to take down that city with some singers and some horns. Does it make any sense? God, the people are going to think we've lost our minds. They're going to think we're crazy. God, we're going to get ridiculed. Listen, that's what faith looks like sometimes. I'm not saying be crazy for crazy's sake, but I am saying not everyone will understand why at the holidays you decide then to be radically generous and sacrificial. Not everybody's going to understand why you say, hey, the best way for me to get ahead is to trust the Lord with my finances. Not everybody's going to understand why you give up your Sunday to be in the house of God with the people of God worshiping. Not everybody's going to understand why you've signed up to be part of Christmas wish list and said, you know, the best thing I can do this holiday season is serve and help Christmas come for others. Not everybody will understand. But faith and obedience will often look ridiculous to people who don't have the promise that you have. But when you've got a promise, you say, God, okay, I'll step into the ridiculous. I'll step into the absurd. I'll step towards you. Listen, if God had told Abraham the entire plan, hey man, here's what I'm thinking. You and Sarah, 25 years from now, on your 100th birthday, baby. Like I don't care how miraculous that is. Nobody's teeing that up as a great idea. The New Testament said they were as good as dead while they were alive. Don't describe anybody, hey man, you look as good as dead today. That is not a flattering way to be described while you're still alive. That's how the Bible talked about Abraham and Sarah. He didn't tell Abraham about captivity and hardship and famine and war. When he originally called Moses, he didn't tell him about the sea and the conflict and the wilderness and the betrayal and leaders that would turn on him and people walking out. If he had told him, I don't think he ever would have made it. When he told Josh it was time for him to be the leader, all he said was, you need to be strong and courageous. He didn't tell him you need to do some vocal exercises and get ready to go into battle with a melody and a trumpet. I don't know if Josh would have taken that step across the Jordan if he knew that God was going to get him to sing at walls. But real faith is a step into the unknown. It's a step towards the impossible. It's a step in the direction of the absurd and the ridiculous. And listen, just like Moses and Abraham and Joshua, if God told you the whole story, if God told you the whole script, if God told you what the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years of your life were going to look like, you wouldn't even believe it. But he tells you exactly what you need to take the next step. And he told them exactly what they needed to take the next step. It was one step at a time. Today, God's just asking you for one step. One step towards impossible, one step towards absurd, one step towards ridiculous. It's one step at a time. It's I'm going to be obedient today, and then I'm going to be obedient tomorrow, and then I'm going to be obedient the next day. One step at a time. So legacy faith has steps. Legacy steps produce legacy stories. There are no stories of God's faithfulness without steps of faith being taken by people. The part of the problem is that everybody wants a story, nobody wants a step. I don't want the discomfort, I don't want the unknown, I don't want to have to believe for impossible things. I'd rather just take sure steps. I'd rather just play it safe. There are no stories without steps. Without a faith step into the unknown, there would not have been a baby shower at 100 years old. But they had Isaac. Why? Because God does miracles when we take steps. Without a step and Moses raising his staff, a whole nation would not have crossed the Red Sea, the waters parting, them looking up at the sides as they put their feet on dry ground, where just a moment ago there was a vast sea. Without a step, that impossible story never gets told. Without a step, the Jordan River doesn't stop flowing. Without a step, the walls don't come down. Without a step. But do you know that there are stories God is writing that you'll never see? So every step has a story, but every step is producing stories or parts of your story that you might never know until you reach heaven and get the whole behind. I think heaven is going to have your life, and then it's going to have all the extra scenes, the deleted scenes, the ones that maybe didn't make the final cut, or like the features where you can watch back and God's narrating over top of a season where you thought you were in trouble, but really he was holding you, sustaining you, protecting you, and keeping you. And it actually happens in this story when we're talking about Moses. We all know that he brought them through the Red Sea. That's the miracle that's easy to see. They went through the sea, but Joshua mentions a miracle that they couldn't see. And in Joshua 24, verse 7, he says, God put darkness between you and the Egyptians and brought the sea over them. So as they're walking and stepping up on the shore on the other side, they're looking ahead to their future. God is back here taking care of the enemy, bringing darkness and confusion, causing the waters to come down over the armies of Egypt. There was something happening at the same time that they couldn't see. It's part of their story, but they couldn't see it. The same thing happens when they're going into the promised land. This is so bizarre to me. I'd never seen this before. And as I was reading through all the things that the Lord did, it says that the Lord sent, this is verse 12 of Joshua chapter 24, and I sent the hornets before you, which drove them out. And I was like, wait a second. God is recounting the story of his faithfulness. And he says, oh, remember the time I sent hornets? Here's my theory. If Joshua knew that God sent an army of hornets in to defeat a real army, he probably would have written it down. Like, that's a pretty wild thing. Like, hey, we were looking at this enemy. We had no idea how we were going to take this city. Then, whoop, God just sent this army of hornets. And man, it was amazing. Like, I don't even think Josh knew. And now the Lord is providing like a director's cut of Joshua's life and the Israelites' journey, is saying, hey, by the way, when you walked in and that army was already in chaos and confusion and it felt easy to take the territory, that's because I sent hornets in to mess with them. Listen, you know how that is. One hornet and you get batty. Imagine an army of hornets moving in. And what I love about this is it's an unseen miracle. God is shedding. There are parts of your story you don't even know God is in control of right now. You don't even know what he's working, but the promise is that he goes before you. He comes behind you. Your life and your journey are marked by unseen miracles. Every one of them are tied to steps of faith. Many of those steps unseen, but just know what you do in the faithful, what you do in secret, what you do in consistency, what you do out of conviction, what you do out of devotion to the Lord, God sees, he notices, and he's working on your behalf. And your story is a result of your step. And over and over and over again, they recount what God has done. Legacy requires steps. Legacy produces stories, but legacy requires a sacrifice. My scene, or this scene in my Bible, the start of chapter 24 has this title, The Covenant Renewal at Shechem. The covenant renewal at Shechem. As one of Joshua's final acts as the leader of the people, he wants the covenant to be renewed. The covenant is that agreement, that relationship between the Lord and his people. Why does he want the covenant to be renewed? Because covenant brings covering. But covenant has a cost. And our covenant relationship with the Lord, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, and you're back, so I figure it's all right to mention again. Our covenant relationship with the Lord is kept intact by our financial obedience. We learned that if you cheat on God, you remove the covering. But if you're aligned with God, you can't stop the covering and the blessing of the Lord from getting into every area of your life. And covenants were always confirmed and supported by sacrifice. And legacy is a re-upping of the covenant. It is a sacrificial moment. Joshua calls the people together for a sacrificial moment. He says, we're going to renew the covenant at Shechem. Listen, when we sacrifice, when we honor the Lord with our finances, when we give generously, it keeps the covenant intact. And so the invitation to sacrifice is actually an invitation, like I mentioned, into a very holy moment. Why? Because Jesus sacrificed for us. And so every time we sacrifice for him, we are simply aligning our hearts with his and doing what he's already done. It pulls us closer to the nature and character of the God we serve. And sometimes we think of sacrificing for the Lord like payment for services rendered. Like, oh, I'll give to the Lord after he shows up and answers this request and that one and works this out like I want him to. That's not how this works. Of course, there is a component of our lives. This is what Joshua in part is getting at, that like, hey, considering all the Lord has done, how can you not? But there's also, we see in the text, sacrificing isn't just about what's been done. It's an investment and a seed into what lies ahead. Why do we know that? Well, because this is called a renewal. That means the covenant has already been established at some point with the sacrifice. Now check this. Shechem, the place where Joshua has gathered together the Israelite people, is the same place that God brought Abraham when he called him. It is the first place that Abraham stopped 500 plus years earlier, and it is the exact spot where God first gave Abraham the promise of a land. So what's happening here is God gives Abraham and Sarah the promise of a land, they build an altar and they sacrifice to the Lord. No audience, no children, no clarity, no hope, no direction, no real understanding other than the fact that they're trying to follow God step by step. And back then, it was just the two of them. And the first time the promise came, it was to one man and one woman. But now, at the renewal of the covenant, in that same spot, you've got millions of people re-upping their relationship and their commitment to the Lord. Joshua brings them to Shechem as if to say, hey, look how far you've come. Look at how faithful God is in the long game. Listen, legacy always starts with sacrifice. Sacrifice is the step that gets you into the game and makes you part of the story God is writing. But sacrifice is also the thing that sustains legacy. So it started with a sacrifice in Abraham, but now it's being sustained and continued with the sacrifice through Joshua. He's reminding them of the magnitude of what they've experienced. Listen, they don't know about the wilderness. They were just kids. Most of them weren't even there at the Red Sea. They've heard, but it wasn't part of their journey. They certainly weren't there when Abraham was called, and they got to keep telling the story, which is why we keep telling the story of Experience Church. Because I would hate for you to roll into this building here or the Southwest location and think, it's an all right thing going on. No, most of you don't know about the hundreds of hot dogs we served at the park before there was even a church, barely cooked. Okay, hot dogs are pre-cooked, barely warm. We're serving hot dogs still frozen in the center to these families and inviting them to a church that doesn't exist because we're just believing that God might have a plan for them and they don't know it yet. You don't know about that. Most of you don't know about the early mornings at Mountain Park School when a bunch of people would gather at a trailer yard, and on days like today, we'd have blow torches that would melt the ice off the wheels so we could get 3 giant trailers out to that school so we could set up a sanctuary and turn it into a place of worship. Most of you don't know that for years and years until we had a permanent stage, I would be on a little trolley underneath the stages that we built every week, singing really awful gospel songs and putting the stage together. Before anybody stood on it, we had to assemble it. Most of you don't know all the seasons of 21 days of prayer where people got on their faces before the Lord and prayed for you before you were even in the building. Most of you don't know about legacy seasons that go back 12, almost 13 years where people said, I'm going to give sacrificially because someday we won't be in this middle school, and someday there'll be more locations, and someday there'll be a seat for my kid, and someday there'll be a seat for my grandkids. Most of you just don't know. And that's okay. That's why we tell the story. I want to tell the story of one man and one woman. 1963, David was 24, Thelma was 17. If you've heard the story, that's great. If you haven't, it's important that you know it. They had a young son. Thelma had just given her life to Jesus, but David was an alcoholic stuck in a cycle of addiction and abuse. A couple of years later, their young son, Anthony, he's 3 years old at this time, but he's known in their town as the crippled boy because his one leg is so seriously shorter than the other, he can't walk. So while most three-year-olds are walking, talking, running, and playing, he drags himself around on the floor. On one particular Sunday night, Thelma invited David. He never came to church. He never wanted to be in church. He didn't care for church. It wasn't his thing, but she begged him, would you please come to church tonight? I think we're going to get a chance to pray for Anthony. So he conceded with her. They went to church. That Sunday night, in a little church on the East Coast, they brought their crippled son, Anthony, to the altar, and they prayed over him. And wouldn't you know it, as they're praying, the leg that made him crippled grew out to be the same size and length as his other leg. Well, immediately, David went home. He dumped out his last keg of alcohol, vowed he'd never drink again. It was such a crazy moment that the next day in a small town, everybody knew the family with the crippled boy. So people started showing up at their house saying, hey, we heard. Hey, we heard. And they opened the door and would watch as Anthony ran around the room full of health, full of life, full of laughter, as if nothing had ever happened. totally healed. Such a crazy moment that David made the decision then and there. Not only did he stop with his addictive behavior, but he made the decision to start serving the Lord. Because of that, he was completely disowned by his entire family. They had no bandwidth to understand why he would become a Christian. They had no capacity for it. When I say disowned, I mean he had 9 brothers and sisters. He never was invited to a birthday party, a holiday gathering. If they saw him walking on one side of the street, they went to the next and made sure he noticed. Nothing to do with him, disowned. The other thing that happened is he was so moved by the power of God and the love of God on display in his little son that he gave his life to Christ, like I mentioned, and he started to give. At this time, they weren't making barely any money. In fact, all that they had was the produce from their garden. And so all that he had to give to the Lord was the first of his actual fruits and vegetables that came from his garden. But so thankful for the miracle, he started to bring 10% of his harvest to the church, thinking, well, if God did this for me, this is the least I can do for him. He gave consistently, sowed consistently, even with nothing, lived a generous life. And the sacrifice is what mattered. Listen, God knows what you have. God knows the capacity to give. God is not here measuring some. He didn't look at David and think, well, that's just peppers and somebody else is giving dollars and cents. He thought, man, that guy is giving till it hurts and they're giving till it hurts. And I'm looking for hearts that are willing to sacrifice. God blessed them. He got a job working in a sawmill, making $1.29 an hour. He describes it as though he were a king and Thelma was his queen. $1.29 for the first time. They could give real money in the offering consistently. They began to sow seed. They were investing. They never missed. He knew that he only had a job because God had been faithful to him. A man with a grade 6 education should not get opportunities like what he was getting, but God blessed them because he was under a covering. Then God opened another door in 1969. Man, they hit the jackpot. At that point, he got a job building houses, making $8 an hour. Sundays were a new thing. They had swagger on Sundays. They walked in with a new confidence, excited to build the church and invest and give back to the house of God. Now they've got 3 sons. They're teaching them how to give. When they get paid from their paper routes, they take their 10%. They're bringing it to the Lord. Consistency, obedience, sowing, growing spiritually. The Bible was always on the table, and the first thing David did every morning was get out of bed, kneel beside the bed and pray over his family, his kids, his future grandkids, his great-grandkids that he didn't even have. By name, he prayed for every sibling that rejected him. He sowed seeds. He lived generous. He opened his home. He offered a helping hand. He prayed consistent prayers and was faithful for 47 years. 47 years in, they started a church in Southeast Calgary. In fact, Experience Church's very first meeting happened in Dave and Thelma's living room. I have a couple of pictures I want to show you. This is them way back at Mountain Park School, serving on the doors, loving on people. This is a little shot. That's my son Tanix and his great-grandfather pushing in some chairs. That's the last time we got a picture all together as a family in church. We're only here because an alcoholic in 1967, 65 started sowing seed into people he had no idea he would ever meet. Had no idea you'd be sitting in the room today. We can draw a direct line to where we are today as a church, to the faithful offerings and prayers that go back 60 years. Experience Church is the compound interest of their seed of faith. Not only that, I'm happy to report that before they passed away, all 9 of his brothers and sisters gave their lives to Jesus because he was faithful and consistent. If you're here today and your life has been transformed, or if you've walked through freedom and God has broken chains off of you, if your kids are back in EC Kids learning about the gospel and the goodness of Christ, if you're here today, then you are part of their legacy too. And Joshua is reminding the people, you did not get here on your own. And I'm reminding you today, we did not get here on our own. A young alcoholic man gave up his addictive behavior 60 years ago, brought vegetables to the Lord. He did not see you. He did not see me. He could not see the future. God couldn't show him all that, but God showed him one step. And one step of faithfulness and obedience has produced a harvest. And listen, he made the decision, as for me and my household, with our vegetables, we're going to serve the Lord. And it wasn't just him. My parents are in the room today. And in 1987, a school teacher and a bank teller made the decision to start a church with their friends. They had no idea that it would plant a seed in their son, but they had a conviction that as for us and our household, we will serve the Lord. And I got to watch as people invested and sacrificed and lived faithfully. Natasha's parents, an oil worker moving from the East Coast, a stay-at-home mom who just believed that God had something for their family, have invested faithfully in this house since before any of you knew we existed or before you thought it was a good idea. We did not get here on our own. There is a generation and generations that have gone before each one of us, of men and women just like you, who said, my job is not what matters. My posture is what matters. It doesn't matter if you're in business or agriculture or education or politics or media or entertainment. If there is a sacrifice in your heart and you put a seed in the ground and a conviction that you and your house will serve the Lord, God cannot stop the covering and the blessing from getting on your family. Joshua was never trying to do more than God asked him to do. He was just trying to obey. Now at 110, he's about to die, and he looks at the people leading and he says, fear the Lord. Fear the Lord. Choose this day who you're going to serve. Fear the Lord. He never tried to force anybody. Listen, I can't force you. It's just a decision moment. I can't choose for you. I can't choose for you to serve the Lord. I can't choose for you to love God. I can't force you to live sacrificially. I'm not even going to try, but what I'm going to do is live by example and let you know I've tried the other gods. I've tried the other ways. I'm confident they don't work. And so if God is undesirable for you, then run after them. But here's what I know. No other God gives miracle babies. No other God frees us from the slavery and captivity of our sin. No other God parts the seas, provides in the wilderness, makes a way where there is no way. There isn't another God who can heal cancer. There isn't another God who can restore a broken heart. There isn't another God who can put a relationship back together. There isn't another God who can hold your family together or reach out to those unsaved children and loved ones and bring them into relationship with him. No other God can take a seed sown in faith and multiply it to have generational impact. So I can't tell you what to do. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And it is a generational thing. When Joshua said, as for me and my household, if you look into the word household in the original language, there are other times where it's interpreted descendants. As for me and my household, as for me and my descendants, he's not only looking back, he's looking ahead. I'm asking you to look back. I'm asking you to look ahead. I'm asking you to look in. What are you choosing to do? It's a generational thing. You saw my son in that video pushing in chairs. He's always loved being on the team. They're all serving in some capacity today. Don't take that for granted. It's not really because of anything I've done. It's because of seeds that were planted and prayers that were prayed long before they were reality. Last night, listen, I don't care what you think. I'm just telling you. It doesn't matter to me what you think. Yesterday, in a freaking snowstorm, my kids are like, hey, we go to the bank. It's Legacy Sunday. We tried to discourage it, to be honest with you. The roads were not good. And multiple of them emptied their bank accounts. They've been saving for things, but and so we got together. And I said, hey, at 10 and 12 and 14 and 16, what miracle are you believing for? And they all shared, and we prayed over their offering. Why? Because as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. And I could have spent a lot of time today telling you, hey, there's going to be an expansion. It'll be awesome. And let's do great things in India and South Asia and Africa and all the stuff where we've got great things going on. Listen, God will build his church. Those things will happen. The decision we get to make is, will I take a sacrificial step and be included in that story? As for you and your household, who are you going to serve?